or to have a discussion, what I'm going to do is introduce some initial questions to specific speakers to aim to drive the discussion towards the set of policy issues that we're concerned about. Our goal is to identify those major issues, to identify areas of disagreement to help us for further fact-finding. One point I need to make is we will attempt to take questions from the audience as well. The way we're going to do that is, you can see kids in the FFA jackets down the hall passing out cards. If you fill out some questions, pass them back over as we go on, they're eventually going to get moved up to me, and we'll aim to fit those in if we can in this fairly short period of time that we have to work with. Let me just walk through some brief introductions. Gentleman sitting to my left is Ray Gasser. Ray's a farmer from Corning, Iowa, where he produces approximately 6,000 acres of corn and soybeans. He's been active as a leader on the Iowa Soybean Promotion Board, the Iowa Soybean Association, and the American Soybean Association. To Ray's left is Neil Harl, the Curtis Distinguished Professor in Agriculture at Iowa State University. Dr. Harl's main areas of interest include organization of the farm firm, taxation, estate planning, and legal and economic aspects of farm finance. What I think I found most impressive is that Neil has had over 3,300 speaking appearances in 43 states.
Just 3,300.
Yeah, 3,300. I might bet that puts him ahead of the secretary. Next, Dermot Hayes is professor of economics and finance at Iowa State, leads the policy task force of the Plant Science Institute at Iowa State. Neil and his wife farm 900 acres of corn, soybeans, and cattle. Next is Diana Moss. Diana is the vice president and senior fellow of the American Antitrust Institute. An economist, Diana has managed projects for AAI, including antitrust, mergers and acquisitions, regulatory reform, and network access, across a wide range of industries, including transgenic seeds. At the end of the table, Jim Tobin is Vice President for Industry Affairs at Monsanto, where he served in various agricultural marketing and commercial development positions since joining the firm in 1983. Prior to joining Monsanto, Jim was a member of the Agricultural Extension Service in Iowa. He's a member of the Board of Delegates of the U.S. Grain Council, has served on the National 4-H Council, and is a past chairman of the American Seed Trade Association. Okay, what I'm going to try to do is cover three broad areas. We're going to start with a discussion focused on how we got where we are today. What are the driving forces that has driven the seed industry to its current structure? Second broad area of questions are going to involve current status of competition in the industry. And the third set of questions, for which we hope to hold the most time, the last half hour of the session, is going to focus on the future and emerging policy issues as we enter a world in which some seeds are going off patent. Let me start with historic development. My quick summary of how we would think about the seed industry today, which many people have touched on already, is we have a small number of major firms that develop traits, sell those traits through their own seeds, and also license those traits to independent seed companies. We have a declining number of those independent seed companies. In addition, we've had substantial increases in private research and development spending, but declines, certainly in real terms, in public research and development spending on crop science. I'd like to direct my first question to Neil Harl and let him take a shot at summarizing why we've seen that type of major shift in the last 20 years to the type of structure we see today.
Thank you very much. Are we on?
We're on.
We're on. Actually, it's going to require more than 20 years. As I pondered this over the last several days, I concluded that really we needed to divide our past into three eras and focus on A, technology, and B, control, and how those have changed over the time period. And I'm going to emphasize the control side more than I am the technology side, because most of you are fully aware of that. So I'm going to have just a few comments about the open pollinated era, partly through nostalgia, and secondly, the era of hybrids from conventional breeding, and third, the biotech era. There were three major legal developments during that time frame, and I can say with some confidence, I don't believe we handled the third one very well as a matter of public policy. And it didn't come through Congress, it came from the Supreme Court. Now, as we ponder this task, the open pollinated era continued until the 30s. And I can tell you that as it came to its end, it was an interesting experience. At age 3, in February of 1937, I was assigned the task by my father of budding and tipping ears, shelling the irregular kernels off because they didn't go through the planter plates well. And I had the whole month of February to do it, and I used the whole month of February. That was my dad's seed for the 1937 year, and the last year he planted open pollinated. Because he noticed that two of his neighbors had some hybrid seed, and while he had been preaching to me for quite some time, you can't afford to pay the outrageous price they require for hybrid seed, which was a few dollars a bag. But after he saw the yields, he was convinced that that was a good idea, and so moved into the next era. But that era, the technology was simple, although labor intensive. The farmer had total control over the ears, the seed, and the crop, but that was balanced against, of course, the fact that the yields were not as great as the hybrids were. The era of hybrids was assisted by the land-grant universities. And many of you know the land-grant universities essentially provided the inbred lines throughout the period from the onset of the hybrid period until at least the mid to late 1970s, and we'll talk about that transition in just a moment. Now, neither the land-grant universities nor the seed companies retained any control or ownership over the seed or its genetic makeup until at least 1970. There had been a piece of legislation passed in 1930, the Plant Patent Act, but the Plant Patent Act was very narrow. It only applied to asexually reproduced plants. So it was really horticulture. And most of our farm-type seeds did not qualify for protection, intellectual property protection, under the Plant Variety Protection Act. But we need to watch this because as we get to the end of the patent period, we're concerned about the existence of patent rights, but we're also concerned about the existence of PVPA rights as well, and those can lurk where you don't necessarily have a patent right. So we want to emphasize that point. But the producers still had complete control over the seed and over the crop through this period of conventional crop breeding. The universities generally, the land grants generally provided at little cost, in some cases at no cost, to the seed companies, and then they would complete the hybridization process. During this period, the attitude was fairly widespread that seed was considered to be in the public domain. As a matter of fact, I remember some degree of involvement in a couple of instances where veteran seedsmen, they called themselves seedsmen. There were women involved, but they never did get around to calling seeds women. But the seedsmen believed, many of them, that seed was in the public domain. And in one case, one seedsman grabbed a fistful of seed from the wagon of a competitor. In another case, a seedsman went on a midnight foray into the fields of a competitor and harvested a few ears and didn't think anything was wrong with that. That was the attitude. The attitude until we got to the end of that period, the beginning of the biotech era. Now, coincident with the beginning of laboratory manipulations rather than field, the type of conventional crop breeding that had been going on, there was a scramble for germplasm because the Supreme Court The Supreme Court in 1980 decided a key case that allowed the patenting of life forms for the first time. Now, just a little bit of detail here, because the literature is not exactly clear on this point. Some think the Supreme Court reversed the patent examiner. Actually, the patent examiner had said, no, you can't patent life forms. And the Board of Patent Appeals agreed. The next level up, the third level up, said, well, we think that we have to reverse that because times are changing. And it was that opinion that was affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court by a 5-4 decision. Congress was not involved. And moving into the patenting of life forms was a new area for patenting, and we continue to have problems because at no point did Congress exercise any kind of oversight over that patenting process. So that was followed in the 1990s by an almost frenetic move to acquire firms. And the number of seed producers dropped from about 300 plus to the handful that we have today. Those that were large enough to muster capital for genetic manipulation through laboratory operations and to buy out competitors without much fear of a challenge from Washington, DOJ, or FTC. Now, the discovery and development of Roundup Ready, which was patented, coupled with the use of restrictive licensing, gave the company unprecedented influence over even seeds sold by competitors through the use of restrictive licensing arrangements and incentives, economic incentives. The high demand for seeds containing that technology assured the competitors would agree to the terms of the licensing agreements. The terms and the use of incentives permitted the patentee to extend the span of control. So what we have is the transformation of seed business in that 80-year period, almost unbelievable in nature and in scope. No one in 1930 would have been able to forecast what happened, and they'd been terribly surprised if they had seen it. But I think our problems as we look backward is that there was not sufficient oversight over the various key developments during that period, notably the decision to move toward patenting of life forms. And it isn't just agriculture that's having problems. Medical research is also having problems with respect to the patenting of life forms, because you can stake out a segment of germplasm and keep others from being involved with it. So in very short order, I think that's more than my 3 minutes, there are a couple of other issues that I want to talk about later on as we have the opportunity. The big problem today, in my view, is what happens at the expiration of patents. What is it going to take to have a generic market? And we'll, I think, be addressing that later on. I see this as the next big obstacle. I hope when we deal with this one, it will be with a greater degree of insight and possibly the Congress involved, so that, like the 1970 Act, it represents a refereed conclusion based on the various interests that have a stake in this process. Now, I think that's...
Neil, if you want to speak about that, we'll bring you back in that last section. You're using up all of your time.
All right, fine. Thank you.
Let me... Key thing we've identified and that people have spoken about so far has been introduction of intellectual property protection, particularly starting in the famous 1980 Supreme Court decision. Let's talk a little bit about the outcomes from that up till now. And what I want to do is ask Jim Tobin, and then from him get some discussion about how has that expanded patent protection affected investment decisions in the seed industry?
Jim, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I grew up on a farm in southwest Iowa, not far from here. My parents are here. They're still farming near Newmarket. I used to wear one of the blue jackets for Newmarket. It's now consolidated into Villisca and Bedford and Clarendon, so I'm appreciative of them being here tonight, or this afternoon. What has intellectual property meant to the industry? Let's start with it's attracted a great deal of innovation. New investors, new dollars, new opportunities for farmers to choose to use products that help them make money. The Roundup Ready trait, which I'm sure Ray can talk to, for our family farm, it took away the need to walk the beans every summer, saved a couple weeks of time. It helped my dad, who does no-till farming, grow soybeans in a sustainable way and save the soil and made a tremendous difference for farmers. I'm sure many of you remember you could drive down the road and see which farms were using the Roundup Ready technology because they had the cleanest fields. That's just the first step. Today, there are 23 different biotech traits that are available to farmers in corn, cotton, and soybeans. And more importantly, because companies have seen this work, the opportunity to get paid for these new innovations, as farmers have chosen to use them, the pipeline is really full. If you look at the corn and soy opportunities that are coming, not just from one company, but from many companies, there are 50 different traits in that pipeline that are listed as being worked on for the next 10 years. Those traits get broadly licensed to over 200 seed companies that let farmers decide what they want to use. It was very important early on. We recognized that you have to put the very best germplasm with these traits or farmers won't buy them, and that's why there's such a connection to the seed industry, because that's the delivery vehicle. It's an exciting time. There's a lot of choice today. There's going to be a lot more choice in the future, and there's tremendous competition for the farmers' business.
Thanks, Jim. We're going to get a little bit of, seek the panel for a little bit of a reaction in a moment, but I want to get one more point in on this introductory topic. And I'd like to give Ray Gasser speak about, from his experience, how has farming changed on his operations as a result of having these seeds.
Thank you. And it's really an honor to be here, as everyone else has mentioned. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, and others for allowing this to happen. I'm a farmer with a family business. My wife and I have been farming in Iowa for 32 years. And now I'm proud to say that our son's joining our operation, and we're really happy for that. And we've used technology over the years to do a better job of farming, to help our friends and our neighbors. We partner with our neighbors, actually, in helping them and us to pull together our resources and maybe buy seeds in a volume, and that gives us the discounts and allows us to be competitive in a world market. I can't tell you how nervous I was the first time I sprayed Roundup on my soybeans about 1996. I think a lot of you out here have that same feeling. We planted the soybeans. A month or so later, they were about this high, and they looked beautiful. And here I'm putting Roundup in a tank that I'm used to not doing and spraying it over the top of my soybeans. And I'll tell you that I watched that crop every day for a week. And it was right by the road, of course, so were my neighbors. But you know what? The technology worked. And it transformed me, and it transformed agriculture in the United States. And so technology has been very helpful for us. And we need to be careful what we do, that we have the use of technology and that we don't stifle innovation. But at the same time, with that innovation and with that market share, we have responsibilities. We have responsibilities that at the end of a patent, that farmers and consumers can benefit from that patent ending, and that we have a generic market, that we can save money on our seeds that we plant, that we need to know that those seeds are registered around the world. And I think that's one of the big concerns that we have, is the registration process. It's the process of moving through patent expiration. And I hope that's an important subject here today.
Thanks. I have to be the tough guy on time, which is why I'm cutting people off and driving them. We got about 2 minutes left on this initial issue of how the policy changes, particularly regarding patenting, have affected investment and farming decisions in the industry. Have any other reactions from the panel on what's been said so far? Anyone else? Okay, let me move on. Let's talk a little bit about current state of competition in seeds. I'll direct it straight to Diana Moss. How should I think about structure? Is this a highly concentrated industry?
Am I on?
You're on.
Yes, okay. So first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's an honor, and I've learned so much so far today listening to these different perspectives. Jim has asked me to talk a little bit about the structure of the markets that are important here. And I think one thing to put out there initially is is to think about what these seed platforms look like. And a platform or a system, as we think of them in antitrust, economics, and law, consist of multiple markets. So you have upstream markets, in this case a market for traits, and you have a market below that, or a downstream market for traded seed. There's obviously, there are levels in between. Germplasm could be considered separately. Depends who you talk to. But the point is, these markets form platforms, and we have an increasing degree of vertical integration between traits developers and seed companies. And the number of independent seed companies, which have heretofore been a very important channel in getting to the farmer, have decreased dramatically in size over time. And that's an important thing. So when we look at these seed platforms, we look at traits markets, we look at traded seeds, really the question for us is, what are the alternatives? So good antitrust analysis always pursues the questions from the consumer's perspective. What are the alternatives? So what alternatives are there amongst traits for herbicide tolerance and insect resistance? What alternatives are there for seeds, for traded seeds? So if you ask the question in that way, I think it gets you to a very important place. And that is, if you look upstream at traits markets, they are very, very highly concentrated. There is, in effect, a monopolist in the market for traits, and that is Monsanto. It's an inescapable fact. What I am saying says nothing about the value of innovation. We think innovation is important. We think the patent laws in the United States are important in promoting innovation. If we didn't have them, we probably wouldn't have the type of risk-taking behavior that we do that provides new products. So innovation is important. The question moving forward is how concentrated are those markets? Well, they're very concentrated. And are there alternatives available in those markets? And I think the answer is, and this has been the source of much of the controversy, there aren't many alternatives upstream. All right? Now, if we look downstream, what we see are markets for traded seed. So Monsanto has broadly licensed its technology. I think that's probably at its core a very good thing. We will get into questions about how that technology has been licensed and whether it actually promotes or frustrates competition. But I think what's deceptive about the downstream traded seed markets is they give the illusion of choice. There are lots of brands, there are lots of varieties, and that's all good. But if you connect the two markets, that's where we start asking some really hard questions. And the good analogy is looking at your computer. If you look at your computer, what do you see? You see one operating system. You can buy a Dell, you can buy an IBM, you can buy a Compaq, you can buy a Sony, but when you turn the thing on, there's one operating system. And the analogy is very good on the seed side. Similarly, you can turn on your computer and see what makes it work, and that's a microprocessor chip. Well, who's out there providing microprocessor chips? There's Intel, who has about an 80% market share, and then there's AMD, which has fought very hard for many years to get a foothold in that market. So the point here is that we have two markets. The upstream market for traits is very highly concentrated. It's essentially monopolized by a single firm. The downstream market has more competition, but is still very highly concentrated. Some of the causes of concentration, obviously, are mergers over time, both vertical mergers, which link together these two markets, but also the acquisition of successive seed companies over time has created concentration downstream. All right? There are incentives, once you have a monopoly, to extend your monopoly or to maintain your monopoly. And I think that very question is what we're trying to get at today in some of this public discussion. Effects of concentration, obviously less choice. Less choice for seed companies seeking to create new products, less choice for farmers who want to shop around and access other products. Another result of less competition or concentration are higher prices. We've seen, Dermot's going to talk about higher prices here in just a moment. That's of grave concern, really grave concern, I think. And we have to separate the high price argument, I think, from the argument that, well, higher prices are okay because farmers have so much more productivity. I think the two have to be separated to have a really frank discussion about the effects of concentration and price. The effects of concentration also affect innovation. There's a connection between competition and innovation. We generally get more innovation if there's competition, as opposed to having one firm dominate and control the process. And finally, later on, we'll talk about what to do. And I think that will enter into the discussion about generics. Thank you.
Let me just remind our panelists that we need to speak into the microphones so they can hear us a little bit better in the back. So pull the mic a little bit closer to yourself. Any reactions off the panel on Diana's discussion of concentration?
If I could, Jim,
shares?
I'd like to
Go ahead,
comment.
Jim.
I've read your paper, and I appreciate that people feel very strongly about this. I'd like to start by saying that the operating system model is not a good analogy for the seed business, and let me tell you why. If you want to grow soybeans, you don't need Roundup Ready to make the soybeans grow. They grow just fine. There are people who grow conventional soybeans, and Ray can speak to this, who do just fine. It's because farmers choose to use a herbicide-tolerant trait that they ask the seed company to have that for them, and they decide every year what they're going to plant. Let's go back to the early days, 96, when Roundup Ready first came to the market. There was another trait called STS that was developed by DuPont. It was available at the same time. Some of you probably planted that. Every year, farmers get to decide, for example, do you want to use Roundup Ready? Do you want to use STS, or would you like to use conventional? There are weed control systems to handle each one of those. There are a number of choices. Farmers decide. Yes, we broadly licensed our Roundup Ready trait, but that's a good thing. We allowed a broad group of companies in the industry, and I helped in the early works on that. And people really like the idea that they could get these traits in any brand of seed that they wanted. It's worked well for farmers. It's worked well for Monsanto. Today, there's another new trait called Liberty Link that's just been launched by Bayer. So innovation continues. I told you earlier that there's 50 new traits in the pipeline for corn, soy, and cotton. And that, I think, is really good evidence that others look at this market and say there is an opportunity and I want to invest in it. So there is value. Farmers make decisions. They're very, very good at making those decisions. And that's why we have high market share with Roundup Ready and soybeans. It's not because you have to have Roundup Ready as an operating system to make the soybean variety yield and grow in the farm.
Let me quickly bring in one point Jim touched on and several members of the audience touched on. Access to conventional seeds. About 85% of corn acreage is biotech varieties now. 92% of soybean acreage, according to USDA statistics. I want to direct a quick focus question to Ray and ask him to address the issue of do we have sufficient access and sufficient plant breeding programs for non-GMO seeds?
Well, I guess I would have to admit that the plant breeding to conventional seeds has gone down as a percent. But everyone I've talked to, especially in soybeans around the country, there is access to conventional seeds. In our local, it used to be a co-op, and now it's another company owns that. But we have a really good market for conventional soybeans there, with a $2 premium per bushel for farmers who choose to grow them. We have the Asoya group that we talked about this morning that had their own conventional varieties and were successful for a while, but found that consumers weren't willing to pay. And I guess we don't understand that exactly. We're trying to offer things that the consumer wants, but maybe they're not always willing to pay the premium. At Iowa State University here, Dr. Walt Fair, the checkoff, the Iowa checkoff and the national checkoff funds that program greatly, and I'll tell you that Dr. Fair is almost a god in Japan because of the food-grade soybeans that he grows there. So there is opportunities. It is somewhat limited, but in relation to the 8% or so of the total demand for soybeans, it's probably not too far out of line. There is availability.
Any reactions on that? Anybody else in the panel want to offer a point on that? Let me get to pricing, since we still have a little time on this. I'm going to direct a question to Dermot Hayes. Again, according to other USDA statistics, average prices for biotech soybean seeds rose by a little over 60% between 2004 and 2009, according to our numbers. Average prices for biotech corn rose by about 93% in that same period. Dermot, do you have some analysis of why we might have been seeing those increases? What do you think is going on?
Sure. I better apologize to everybody. I've got a funny accent. I grew up in Ireland and moved here in '81, and still haven't managed to get rid of the accent. I farm a little bit with my wife, and last spring we went into Sam's Club and saw corn, non-GMO corn, for $100 a unit, or about $40 an acre. But we chose to spend about $100 an acre, or $250 for the seed we bought, and that's because the seed companies are packing in so much more into that bag. And apparently, a lot of other farmers made the same decision we did, because the average price of seed is closer to the high end rather than the low end that was available to us. And that's because it cuts our herbicide bill and our pesticide bill, and we get a yield boost relative to the seed we could have bought for $100. That was $100 a unit. That was 5 or 6 years old. So that's the answer. But there's a more interesting question, and that is the U.S. has been running a great natural experiment. We have strong IP for corn, and we have a very weak IP for wheat. The strong IP has attracted innovation, and corn yields are growing up, and despite a bad summer last year, we had record corn yields. Wheat yields are flat, and have been flat for quite a while. I went back to the year I came to this country, '81, and we had more wheat acres than corn acres. There's been a net transfer now from wheat to corn, with 10 million more acres of corn than wheat. It used to be corn produced about 3 times more volume than wheat. Now corn produces 6 times more volume than wheat, because of it attracted acres, and the yields have grown so much faster. So let's think about that Kansas wheat farmer, former Kansas wheat farmer that's now growing corn. Are they being ripped off by the corn companies? Well, why did they grow corn? Why did they switch out of wheat? Are we in the public sector doing a good job of getting new products to market? We probably are, but not as good as the private sector. So I would argue that the natural experiment would favor what's gone on with corn, and the benefits that have flown in higher yields have benefited consumers and producers.
Anybody else want to give us an action on prices? Any other?
One other comment I might
sure.
have. I just read an article a couple of days ago, University of Missouri's yield trials. In 2000, about 30% was conventional varieties. 2006 was only 1%, but last year was back up to 15%. So we are seeing maybe some demand or some more interest in conventional varieties, and I think there's a place for every one of us in this market.
This gives us we've got a fair amount of time left. That's good for talking about the stuff that's really emerging powerfully now, and where we have a series of major policy issues emerging, facing several departments of the government as well as industry. The Roundup soybean trait goes off patent in crop year for 2015. In the years after that, several other traits are going to go off patent. We have what, in essence, is going to be another brave new world of how we handle policy for these things. We have a set of issues we want to cover. I want to start off by directing a question back to Ray and asking about, in this world, it appears, I keep hearing from farmers that things are highly uncertain, and they don't like uncertainty, making long-run planning and crop planning decisions. And I'd like Ray to address the issue of where this uncertainty arises and what he and his colleagues feel are needed for better clarity and transparency in the process. So Ray's going to start us off.
Oh, thanks a lot. And our groups at the Iowa Soybean Association, American Soybean Association, we've spent a lot of time talking to everyone in the industry, from large tech providers to small seed companies to universities. And we find that at the top of the pile is really comes to be the uncertainty in the market, the uncertainty in license agreements, the uncertainty in the breeders' ability to continue to use Roundup Ready 1s particularly, but also, you know, how they will be able to use the Roundup Ready 2 patent. Well, we're also concerned about future traits and registrations, whether it's registrations for the Roundup Ready 1, will it continue around the world? Who will be in charge of that? I think that's the really big issue there. But future traits, and can small companies actually register a product? It costs $100 million to register a product around the world. And that's part of our competitive issue here. Small companies aren't able to access that market, and we need to find a way to help them through the system.
Ray, let me just bring us a little bit further along. Ray's identified a big issue is registration. What I want to do is take a little bit of time, a significant amount of time, to talk about that. I want to ask Jim Tobin to tell us a little bit about what exactly has been involved in registration, since it's a major function of what Monsanto's been doing and something we need to think about when we go to generic seeds. Can you?
Yes, for the registration people in the crowd, I'm going to really summarize quickly, but when we register a product like the Roundup Ready trait that Ray's talking about, we received approval from the USDA, from FDA, and from EPA, and each of them have a separate role to play in the United States. In the case of Roundup Ready, you get deregulation in that process, and so there's no new regulation work that has to be done for Roundup Ready in soybeans. That's done. And when we go around the world, Ray and his colleagues export a big part of their crop. It's a really important part of their business. And so we register with more than 40 countries around the world where soybean or soybean products are sent. About 27 of those countries represent the European Union, and they're supposed to work all together, but that doesn't always work quite that way. We have to do a lot of things to make sure that we have that in place. There are 7 countries that will require either a renewal or a new registration over a period of time, maybe 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. What's in a registration package? Well, if you stacked up the reports, there's about 50 reports. They're about 1.5 feet high. The work is done by company scientists who are developing the product, and we also hire third-party experts to come in and help do regulatory work. You're looking at safety for food and human consumption, for food consumption and feed use. You're also looking to ensure that the product is effective. You're looking to ensure that the soybean plant isn't changed in any way, if that's the claim that you're making, which is the case here. That work is very involved. It doesn't cost $100 million. What Ray was quoting is the cost of bringing a new trait all the way from the beginning step through regulatory approval. It is expensive, but it's not quite that expensive. But that is what we invest in the whole process of 8 to 10 years. So the question then is, with these regulatory approvals, what do you do when something goes off patent? And let me just address that quickly. Monsanto's patent will end with the planting of the 2014 crops. So in 2015, we'll no longer have a patent on the Roundup Ready trait. If someone licenses it from us, a seed company or you as a farmer, we won't collect anything. We won't be owed any royalty. Our work will be done relative to the licensing and getting paid a royalty. However, because when a farmer produces a crop, you want to make sure it has a market. We've worked closely with Ray and others at the American Soybean Association. We've committed that we'll maintain this regulatory package, the renewals that are needed in these countries around the world, for a period of at least 3 years after the patent goes off, so until the end of 2017. Now, of course, Ray is concerned because he's going to possibly be using some of this material off patent, and he wants to make sure there's a market. What we're proposing, and we're willing to have a lot of people at the table for this, we think that whoever wants to use it, whatever seed company or developer that wants to use the Roundup Ready trait off patent, we've put a proposal together and provided it to the bio-industry organization where trait developers work on stewardship policies and said, if you want to use this, we'll make it available. If you can pay the cost of the registration, share that cost, we'll continue that as long as you want us to do it. Our data packages would be available. It's about $1 to $2 million a year to maintain this. So we would welcome anybody in the industry that wants to get involved in helping find a solution. We think an industry approach is an appropriate way to go, but we're open to a lot of ideas and approaches to make sure that if farmers want to use this, if breeders want to breed with it, it'll be available and there won't be any challenges with regulatory. And Ray, you have my commitment and the commitment of my company that we'll make sure that these regulatory approvals are in place so that you can export your soybeans.
Appreciate that.
Let me move this discussion of the registration process along a little bit. And I want to ask Diana for her view on whether we need new rules or agreements aimed at improving that process.
Okay, thanks for that. If I can just back up for 30 seconds and maybe put a slightly different perspective on this. With Roundup Ready 1 going off patent, this will be the first opportunity to have competition in biotechnology seed. And that's a big thing. There has been proprietary technology. Again, that's attributable to our patent laws in the U.S. That's good. It promotes innovation. But once the patent expires, that's when the window starts to open. I would argue the window opens long before that, in part because the pipelines take a number of years to populate with potential new products. That means that rival biotech developers in this world of stacked trait products need to get access long before the patent expires to be able to seamlessly transition and have those products ready for market by the time Roundup Ready is off patent. So there's potentially a gap here where if we do not construct the right set of policies and conditions and to smooth this transition, all of this generic competition is in jeopardy. And the people who suffer from that are not only rivals in the industry, but the seed companies and the ultimate consumers. We all deserve to benefit from generic competition, just like we have in pharmaceuticals. And you all remember paying really big prices for some of these branded pharmaceuticals that now you pay literally pennies for. So I would view this process as really a two-part process. One is to work with the patent holder, and Monsanto has stepped forward in a very positive, constructive way. I do not think that those commitments go far enough. I think there has to be more work done on making data available. I think there needs to be an extension of the registration process in excess of 3 years. There have to be commitments not to sue for patent infringement if rival biotech developers want to get R&D programs going, all right? Anti-stacking provisions have been problematic to date and could easily gut the whole transition to generic biotech seed. And I think it's really important to note that unless this whole process is constructed smoothly and in a way that promotes efficiency, what is sold outside the United States will have a direct impact on sales in the U.S. We all know that. Unless you get your registrations, unless the process is nicely dovetailed, what you expect to sell overseas can impact what you sell inside the United States. I don't think a legislative solution is going to work fast enough. A Hatch-Waxman type of approach that we saw on the generic pharmaceutical side, I think, is unwieldy. It may be a longer-term solution.
Let me break in right on that,
now.
not to stop you, but to ask you if you'll expand a little and tell people what you mean by a Hatch-Waxman process.
The Hatch-Waxman Act, I'm no expert on Hatch-Waxman, but the point to make is that Hatch-Waxman put into place certain rules and regulations that enabled the promotion of generic pharmaceuticals before they went off patent. It enabled generic drug manufacturers to work within some windows to bring these new products to market by engaging in the research and development. And there are obviously many details to be worked out. I think the devil is in the details, but it really consists of a two-part process, working with Monsanto and developing the institutions to promote this. I would even suggest a generic biotech seed organization, much like the Generic Pharmaceuticals Association. You get on their website, they've got a whole set of policy issues that can be nicely juxtaposed on what's going on in biotech seed. So I think it's really a two-pronged issue.
I think Diana has touched on the entire, well, not the entire, Diana's touched on the set of issues that we want to cover. I'm going to ask first Neil and then Dermot what their views are on the proper mix of IP protection going forward as we look at this issue.
On this issue, I think the important point is, it's already been noted, the farmers don't want to buy a lawsuit. And so when you're going generic, you want to be sure there is total purity. We've been through this with Starlink. We know there's mechanical contamination. We know there's pollen drift, all kinds of reasons why patented material do get into other germplasms. But there's more than that. There's also the PVPA, the Plant Variety Protection Act. There could be that kind of intellectual property protection existing within a bag of generic seed and that may not be at all clear because you've thought, well, this is just a Roundup Ready problem. There may be other patented or PVA protected rights within that bag. So we have purity issues. And this is why I've concluded that I think it's necessary for this to be a matter of regulatory action. I think industry should be involved. I think there should be a process by which the best minds pull together the limitations, the conditions, the restrictions that should be part of a generic seed regimen. But I think it really has to come eventually to the point where we have the enforcement power of government and the objectivity and fairness that comes the same way.
Dermot, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just to emphasize that there is an urgency about this. If we fail to maintain our registration in China, and we will definitely, and the year comes when that becomes an issue, we will definitely have Roundup Ready 2 in our system. Therefore, and we can't separate that back out of the commodity system. So therefore, we lose the Chinese market. So what everybody has said here is we need a third-party institution to accept the offer from Monsanto to take that data and start that 5-year registration process and make sure it's finished in time. And if anything good comes out of this whole conference, it would be that third-party institution. My preference would be for the Soybeans Association or ASTA, but if Neil's suggesting a regulatory approval, it's 6 of one and a half dozen of the other, but we definitely need to get that going. Monsanto's made a pretty generous offer. Most companies would actually sell that data at this stage, and so I think it's time to move, and I hope that the people who have that kind of authority in the room are listening.
There has to be unquestioned objectivity and standing in the world economic community for it to really work. And that's why I think a third-party presence makes a lot of sense also.
Ray, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, at ASA, we have been talking about this issue a lot, and it is really important to us. And we do everything that Diana and everyone down the line said is actually true. It's so important that we solve the issue with Roundup Ready 1s, but there's many other traits coming on that will expire soon, and we have to acknowledge those needs also. But time is of the essence here. We don't have a lot of time with Roundup Ready 1s if we want to have the ability to use it generically in the United States and around the world.
Jim, do you have anything to add? Yeah.
Just a couple things. As I said earlier, we welcome industry involvement. We think there should be a lot of people at the table when this is sorted out because it is the first major trait coming off patent. And we welcome insight and support in doing that. I'd like to make just a few points so people know what the generic picture will look like. First of all, there are over 150 seed companies that are licensed today to use the Roundup Ready trait in soybeans. Every one of them will have the ability to sell in 2015 Roundup Ready in soybeans without any new regulatory work, without any new legislation. That's already possible because the soybeans reproduce, as they're producing the seed, reproduce that trait. There are also a number of stacks that have already been enabled. The STS stack that I mentioned earlier is planted on, we estimate, about 3 million acres. So Roundup Ready with STS is available and can be available in the future. We've enabled a number of other stacks, a stack with Plenish, a new oil quality trait that DuPont has. We made our data package available to them so they could do that. There's a new 2,4-D trait that's coming out that there would be the ability for someone in the industry to stack that, and we would provide regulatory support for that. So it's possible without new regulation for quite a bit of this to occur already, but we're very open to having discussions about additional things in that area and also the regulatory support for the international approvals. We think is a good approach, and like I say, we've made that offer to the industry. So just a few things to clarify the discussion here.
Let me bring up a related question and throw it out to the panel, which is there a role for continued public investment in plant breeding? What's that role? And what should we be doing in the public sector that we're not doing now in terms of support of plant breeding? Anybody want to take that?
I would like to address that briefly. I was on the ACAB, Advisory Committee on Agricultural Biotechnology, 2000-2002. It was really created to deal with the Terminator. Some of you may recall the Terminator controversy. But we also dealt with the question of how to cope with the very issues we're dealing with here today. And the conclusion was that one of the steps should be an increased amount of spending in the public sector to encourage conventional crop breeding. And we sent that, I think, to everyone in positions of responsibility. Unfortunately, since then, we've been in a period of difficulty with respect to budgets. And so the amounts have actually been declining over time. So if there's enough public interest in this to support it in Congress and support it at the state level, I think this is a good thing to do. It also adds another element to the concentration issue because they can feed germplasm into the system as they did back in the 70s. Well, different kind of germplasm, of course, but I think it is an essential part of the total solution today is to encourage that. It's just, as I look ahead, I don't see much chance for that because of the shortage of funds.
Any reactions? Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd speak to that a little bit, and thank you. That you're exactly right, and the Iowa Soybean Association and American Soybean Association has really been trying to push that idea. At the checkoff level, the state and national do invest in soybean research, at our universities and small businesses. But at the national level, there's really a limited amount, and our associations have been pushing for a long time for increased funding for particularly soybean research, because that's our charge. But for more research in production agriculture and continuing the conventional traits and giving a generic market to farmers and having that option.
Mr. Dermott.
One of my colleagues at the university, Pat Schnabel, is responsible for the big project to examine the corn genome. And that's fantastic research, and it's something I'm very proud to be associated with. However, and there's a lot of other good basic research on disease and agronomy, and that's all legitimate public sector, taxpayer-funded basic research. We haven't, if you look at the wheat example, there is public sector research on wheat, but I think university professors are not real good at making wholesale calls and meeting deadlines and forming teams. And so probably we're not as good as we could be, as the private sector is, at taking that basic research and turning it into a sales product. And therefore, I think there's a natural break-even point, and that is the public sector does a lot of basic research and should get funding for that. But when it gets to the point where a private sector company can do it more efficiently, then I think we need to turn it back over.
Any other reactions on the panel? Diana?
Can I just make one comment? Just listening to what's been said here, I think perhaps with generic Roundup Ready 1, we will get more public sector funding because of the lack of restrictions on how the traits can be used and combined with other traits to potentially produce new products. But I think the whole catchphrase here is certainty. If we want a successful experience with the development of generic Roundup Ready, then there has to be certainty. And the certainty should have started about 5 years ago. And not today. I would argue that we're even behind the curve, even starting with this today. It's really a very urgent situation because of the lead times involved, because of the production of very complex stacked traded products. Certainty is the name of the game. If we want to get new products to market, there has to be clarity, there has to be certainty, there has to be a clear set of rules that are enforced, and preferably that have all the stakeholders involved and are pursued not only at the federal level, but hopefully at a regional or a state level as well.
I think, looking at the clock, that we'll give Diana the last word on that. One point I want to make, I noticed our stenographer here, DOJ typically publishes the results of these workshops. They publish the transcripts on their website. I don't know when that'll be. But for those of you who want to stay on top of it or review what's been said here, though, that information is going to be available. Our panel members will be around after the panel. For those of you who want to ask them a little bit more about positions they've taken. And right now, I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel members for their time and insights.
Yes, take care. Say, do you people